Most people think brain failure begins when something obvious stops working. A hand trembles. A word disappears. A memory collapses. Something visible finally announces that damage exists. The command is sent. Nothing moves. A delay appears before the body responds, but the delay is small enough to ignore. The hand eventually reaches the object. The sentence eventually forms. The person continues moving through the day, believing the system corrected itself. What actually changed was not strength. The change was timing. Neural communication no longer arrived when it was supposed to. Inside the brain, billions of cells depend on synchronized electrical transmission, traveling through insulated pathways called white matter tracts. These tracts connect distant regions into coordinated systems. Movement depends on them. Language depends on them. Decision-making depends on them. The brain does not function as isolated locations. It functions as timing-dependent communication between separated structures. Multiple sclerosis demonstrates this failure clearly because the disease attacks myelin directly. Myelin is the insulating material wrapped around axons that allows electrical signals to travel rapidly and efficiently. When that insulation degrades, signals slow down, scatter, or fail entirely. The neuron may remain alive while communication becomes unreliable. White matter degradation creates a different type of neurological failure than direct tissue destruction. A neuron can still generate a signal while the pathway carrying that signal becomes unstable. This distinction matters because the brain can appear structurally functional while communication quality silently deteriorates. Underneath normal behavior, a healthy neural network depends on conduction velocity remaining synchronized across multiple regions simultaneously. The frontal cortex may initiate a command, but execution requires coordination with motor pathways, sensory feedback systems, cerebellar timing circuits, and spinal transmission routes. If one pathway slows by milliseconds, while others remain synchronized, the system begins producing small errors before catastrophic failure appears. Signal timing determines whether actions feel automatic or delayed. Reaching for a cup requires prediction before contact occurs. The brain calculates resistance, distance, grip pressure, and muscle recruitment continuously before conscious awareness detects movement. White matter disruption interferes with this predictive synchronization first. The person notices clumsiness before weakness. Small vessel disease produces a slower version of the same collapse. Tiny blood vessels deep inside the brain gradually stiffen and narrow over years. White matter receives less stable oxygen delivery because these communication highways depend heavily on microvascular support. Damage accumulates diffusely instead of explosively. Signal quality decreases long before major strokes occur. The brain attempts to hide this degradation through rerouting. Secondary pathways increase activity when primary connections weaken. Functional MRI studies show expanded activation patterns in individuals with early white matter injury because additional regions are recruited to complete previously automatic tasks. More tissue becomes involved just to preserve normal output. This compensation creates a dangerous illusion of stability. Performance appears preserved while efficiency collapses underneath it. Tasks that once required minimal energy now demand broader recruitment across multiple networks. A person still completes the task, but metabolic cost increases. Fatigue appears earlier. Concentration becomes unstable. Recovery after cognitive effort slows. White matter exists primarily beneath the outer cortex because its role is transmission rather than processing. Gray matter performs local computation. White matter carries information between computational centers. The system resembles a distributed network rather than a centralized processor. Damage to communication architecture fragments coordination, even when individual regions remain partially intact. The frontal lobe cannot regulate behavior effectively if incoming information arrives asynchronously. Emotional control begins destabilizing because inhibitory timing weakens. Responses become slightly delayed or slightly exaggerated, depending on which pathways lose synchronization first. Early degeneration often appears psychological before it appears neurological. Leukorrheosis reveals this pattern frequently in aging populations. MRI scans show diffuse white matter abnormalities associated with vascular instability and chronic ischemia. Many individuals initially present with slowed thinking speed rather than memory loss. Processing becomes inefficient because communication pathways degrade before cortical destruction becomes severe. Milliseconds begin separating intention from execution. That separation changes behavior long before anyone recognizes disease. A conversation becomes harder to follow because language processing depends on rapid exchange between auditory systems, working memory circuits, and executive interpretation networks. The words are heard correctly, but integration slows. Responses become delayed. The person compensates by simplifying interaction or withdrawing from cognitively demanding environments. Myelin normally allows saltatory conduction, where electrical impulses jump rapidly between nodes along the axon instead of traveling continuously. This dramatically increases conduction speed while reducing metabolic demand. Once myelin degrades, impulses leak outward during transmission. Speed decreases. Reliability decreases. Energy demand increases simultaneously. Oligodendrocytes maintain this myelin infrastructure throughout the central nervous system. These cells are highly vulnerable to inflammation, ischemia, oxidative stress, and metabolic instability. When oligodendrocytes fail, repair mechanisms weaken progressively. Repeated low-grade injury begins accumulating faster than restoration can occur. Alzheimer's disease is commonly associated with cortical plaque accumulation, but white matter degeneration also appears early in disease progression. Communication pathways connecting memory systems deteriorate before severe cortical atrophy fully develops. The memory itself may still exist temporarily, while retrieval networks lose synchronization. This changes the nature of forgetting. The problem is not always storage failure first. Sometimes access timing becomes unstable. Retrieval arrives too slowly or incompletely because communication between hippocampal systems and cortical association regions degrades. Delayed recall emerges before total memory absence. Signal degradation also alters prediction systems responsible for maintaining smooth movement. The cerebellum continuously compares intended movement against sensory feedback in real time. White matter disruption delays the comparison loop. Movements become less fluid because correction signals arrive after execution has already progressed. The body starts overshooting or hesitating during ordinary actions. Typing becomes inconsistent. Walking speed subtly changes. Hand coordination fluctuates between normal and delayed states depending on fatigue, inflammation, sleep quality, or vascular stability. The inconsistency itself becomes a marker of communication instability. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy demonstrates another pathway toward white matter collapse. Repetitive head impacts stretch and shear axonal fibers microscopically. Damage accumulates diffusely across long-range communication networks. Symptoms may remain hidden for years because compensatory rerouting temporarily preserves outward function. Electrical transmission inside the brain depends on precision more than force. A signal arriving late can be as disruptive as a signal failing entirely. Neural systems evolved around synchronized timing windows measured in milliseconds. Once those windows destabilize, coordination deteriorates gradually before obvious disability appears. The brain continues sending commands normally during early degeneration. The network delivering those commands does not. Not all white matter degeneration follows the same trajectory. Some forms advance rapidly through inflammatory destruction, while others spread slowly through vascular instability and metabolic erosion. The visible symptoms may overlap, but the underlying communication behavior differs depending on how conduction pathways are being damaged. Multiple sclerosis produces intermittent disruption because inflammatory attacks target specific regions unpredictably. Conduction may fail suddenly during active demyelination, then partially recover after inflammation subsides. The instability fluctuates because surviving axons sometimes regain temporary transmission capacity through incomplete remyelination or adaptive compensation. Small vessel disease behaves differently. Instead of abrupt lesions, chronic ischemia gradually reduces communication efficiency across diffuse networks simultaneously. Symptoms emerge slowly because conduction quality deteriorates incrementally over years. The decline appears subtle until distributed synchronization finally falls below functional thresholds. Speed changes prognosis because the brain compensates differently under gradual versus rapid degeneration. Slow failure allows rerouting. Rapid failure overwhelms adaptation. Inflammatory injury often produces visible neurological episodes early because abrupt conduction block exceeds compensatory reserve immediately. Vascular degeneration may remain hidden longer because networks gradually redistribute workload while communication efficiency declines silently underneath preserved daily behavior. Reversibility also varies depending on structural integrity. Functional conduction slowing caused by temporary inflammation or metabolic instability may improve partially once stress decreases. Axonal destruction does not recover the same way. Once fiber tracts physically degenerate, rerouting becomes the only remaining adaptation strategy. The distinction between demyelination and axonal loss becomes critical at this stage. Myelin damage primarily disrupts transmission speed and reliability. Axonal degeneration removes the pathway entirely. A slowed signal can still occasionally arrive. A destroyed connection cannot transmit anything at all. Diffusion tensor imaging frequently reveals this transition through declining tract coherence. Organized directional fiber architecture gradually fragments as axons deteriorate. Communication routes that once transmitted synchronized information become biologically discontinuous. Neural traffic loses structured organization across entire systems. The corpus callosum demonstrates these differences clearly because it contains dense interhemispheric communication fibers connecting both cerebral hemispheres. Inflammatory lesions may disrupt isolated regions transiently, while chronic degeneration progressively thins the structure itself. Coordination between hemispheres slows as physical connectivity decreases. Tasks requiring bilateral integration begin deteriorating first. Complex coordination exposes hidden communication weakness rapidly. Activities combining language, spatial processing, motor planning, and executive sequencing simultaneously depend heavily on interhemispheric synchronization. When conduction slows between hemispheres, multitasking efficiency collapses before isolated abilities disappear completely. Alzheimer's disease introduces another progression pattern because cortical degeneration and white matter disruption interact recursively. Damaged communication pathways impair metabolic coordination between cortical regions, while cortical pathology further destabilizes connected networks. Degeneration spreads through systems rather than remaining confined locally. The hippocampus cannot sustain stable memory integration if communication with association cortices weakens progressively. Retrieval becomes fragmented because contextual assembly depends on synchronized interaction across distributed memory circuits. The brain loses continuity before it loses isolated information completely. This creates temporal instability in cognition itself. Thought sequencing becomes harder to maintain across time. A person may begin a task normally, but lose organizational continuity midway because executive synchronization weakens under sustained demand. Attention drifts, planning fragments. Internal sequencing becomes less stable as communication timing fluctuates between partially degraded pathways. Vascular dementia frequently amplifies this fragmentation through diffuse frontal subcortical disconnection. Unlike focal stroke syndromes producing isolated deficits, white matter degeneration disrupts network coordination globally. Processing speed declines across multiple systems simultaneously because communication infrastructure deteriorates diffusely. Behavioral slowing becomes one of the strongest early indicators because distributed communication failure affects timing before content. The person still understands information, but cannot manipulate, prioritize, or respond to it efficiently enough under real-world conditions. Reaction latency spreads through every layer of cognition. Perception slows, interpretation slows, decision formation slows, execution slows. The delay may only involve fractions of seconds initially, but neural systems operate within narrow synchronization windows. Small conduction changes cascade across entire networks because every downstream process depends on previous timing alignment remaining stable. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy progresses through another pathway entirely. Repetitive mechanical stress stretches axons microscopically during repeated impacts. Even when neurons survive initially, the structural integrity of long-range communication fibers weakens progressively. Years later, distributed network instability emerges from accumulated microscopic disconnection. The brain attempts maintaining continuity through compensatory hyperactivation, but long-term over-recruitment creates metabolic burden across surviving networks. Regions operating above normal workload consume greater energy while generating increased oxidative stress. Compensation itself accelerates vulnerability over time. Eventually, rerouting begins producing interference instead of protection. Too many systems compete for synchronization simultaneously. Neural efficiency depends on specialization and timing precision. When excessive regions become involved in basic tasks, communication traffic increases across already weakened pathways. Delay compounds because coordination overhead expands continuously as degeneration spreads. This transition marks the beginning of structural collapse rather than temporary instability. The brain can no longer preserve smooth synchronization through compensation alone. Reserve capacity disappears. Minor stressors begin triggering disproportionate dysfunction because no stable backup pathways remain available. Sleep loss now produces measurable cognitive failure instead of simple fatigue. Emotional stress destabilizes concentration rapidly. Illness worsens processing speed dramatically. The nervous system loses resilience because communication architecture operates permanently near maximal strain. White matter lesions also begin interacting across systems instead of remaining isolated. Damage within sensory pathways increases executive workload. Executive overload worsens emotional regulation. Emotional instability disrupts sleep quality. Sleep disruption weakens myelin maintenance further. Degeneration becomes self-amplifying. The entire brain starts functioning as a stressed network rather than a coordinated system. Every weakness increases pressure on surviving pathways. Neurodegenerative diseases converge towards similar outcomes because communication failure eventually overrides the specific origin of injury. Whether degeneration begins through inflammation, vascular disease, trauma, or protein pathology, the endpoint increasingly resembles large-scale disconnection between once synchronized systems. Language becomes slower because retrieval pathways weaken. Movement becomes hesitant because prediction timing destabilizes. Memory fragments because integration loops fail. Emotional regulation fluctuates because inhibitory coordination deteriorates. Different diseases begin producing similar neurological behavior because the communication architecture underneath them is collapsing through parallel mechanisms. The brain is still generating activity throughout this phase, but activity without stable connection can no longer maintain coherent function. Once communication instability spreads broadly enough, entire biological systems begin interacting abnormally because neural coordination regulates sleep, stress response, hormonal balance. Sleep becomes increasingly fragmented because synchronized neural oscillations required for restorative sleep architecture weaken across distributed networks. Each night restores less than the night before. Stress hormones begin remaining elevated longer after ordinary stimulation because frontal inhibitory regulation weakens against limbic activation systems. Cortisol exposure increases inflammatory signaling, vascular strain, and metabolic instability throughout already vulnerable white matter pathways. The communication infrastructure experiences biochemical pressure continuously. The degeneration starts feeding itself. Damage creates conditions that accelerate further damage. Blood pressure variability intensifies this loop because autonomic regulation depends on stable integration between cortical, hypothalamic, and brainstem systems. White matter disruption weakens that coordination gradually. Cerebral perfusion becomes less stable precisely when communication pathways require increasingly precise metabolic support to survive. Glucose handling deteriorates under chronic neurological stress as well. Sleep instability alters insulin sensitivity. Elevated stress hormones disrupt metabolic regulation. Reduced physical activity decreases vascular resilience. The entire body begins amplifying conditions that worsen white matter injury further. At this stage, degeneration is no longer operating as an isolated neurological event. It becomes system-wide communication instability. The distinction matters because symptoms begin appearing disconnected from each other superficially. Fatigue, mood fluctuation, slowed thinking, balance changes, sleep disruption, sensory overload, emotional instability, and memory inconsistency may appear unrelated individually. Underneath them, the same communication architecture is progressively fragmenting. The brain attempts preserving identity through routine because predictable behavior reduces synchronization demand. Novel environments become exhausting. Unexpected decisions become stressful. Complex social interaction becomes difficult to sustain for extended periods because adaptive processing requires rapid network flexibility. Automatic behavior begins disappearing gradually. Conscious effort replaces unconscious coordination. Simple daily activities require active monitoring that healthy systems normally perform automatically beneath awareness. Life becomes cognitively manual. Emotional responses flatten because rapid integration between emotional salience networks and executive interpretation systems weakens. Spontaneity decreases. Behavioral flexibility narrows. Conversations begin carrying delay, not only in speech production, but in emotional synchronization itself. Facial interpretation slows. Tone integration weakens. Humor processing becomes less immediate because distributed. Timing networks no longer synchronize social information fluidly in real time. Relationships begin changing before diagnosis becomes clear. Other people notice distance before pathology becomes visible. The individual often recognizes something is wrong internally long before imaging or formal testing fully captures the extent of network degradation. Efficiency required to explain it clearly. Structural disconnection eventually reaches a threshold where compensation collapses globally instead of locally. Alternative pathways become overloaded simultaneously. Metabolic reserve disappears across multiple systems at once. Recovery after stress stops occurring fully because surviving networks no longer possess enough redundancy to absorb additional demand. The environment begins outpacing neural integration capacity continuously. Information arrives faster than the brain can coordinate it. A crowded store becomes disorienting. A fast conversation becomes exhausting. A complex decision becomes paralyzing. The world itself begins exceeding synchronization speed. This is why many neurodegenerative conditions eventually produce similar functional outcomes despite different origins. Whether the initiating trigger was vascular injury, inflammation, trauma, or protein accumulation, large-scale communication fragmentation gradually forces the brain into the same endpoint. Disconnected processing systems struggling to maintain coherent integration. Alzheimer's disease eventually disrupts distributed memory and executive networks. Vascular dementia progressively disconnects frontal subcortical communication loops. Multiple sclerosis damages transmission reliability across widespread pathways. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy weakens long-range axonal stability diffusely. Different diseases. Similar endpoint. The communication architecture cannot sustain unified function anymore. The late-stage consequence is not simply memory loss or movement difficulty. The deeper consequence is loss of integrated continuity across perception, thought, emotion, prediction, and behavior. Systems that once operated simultaneously begin functioning as partially isolated fragments. The brain may still contain many surviving neurons during this stage, but survival is not the same as connection. A signal generated inside one region increasingly fails to influence distant systems with the speed, precision, and synchronization required for coherent function. Neural activity continues occurring, yet coordination collapses progressively underneath it. Identity itself depends on continuous integration across distributed neural networks. Personality, memory continuity, emotional regulation, self-awareness, and decision-making are not stored in one location. They emerge from synchronized communication between many systems simultaneously. White matter degeneration attacks that synchronization directly. The person remains physically present while internal coordination fragments. Thoughts become harder to organize. Intentions become harder to execute. Experiences become harder to integrate into continuity. The separation between wanting, processing, and acting grows wider over time. Milliseconds became seconds. Seconds became hesitation. Hesitation became disconnection. The earliest stages looked harmless because the brain successfully concealed the damage through compensation. Small delays appeared survivable. Minor cognitive fatigue appeared ordinary. Slight inconsistency appeared explainable. Meanwhile, the communication infrastructure underneath normal behavior continued degrading silently. The danger was never only neuron death. The danger was losing connection between surviving systems slowly enough that the collapse could hide inside. The command is still sent. The network can no longer deliver it.
Pathology of Fear is a medical documentary series presenting clinically documented neurologic and pathological mechanisms for educational analysis.